Hello, Laura, and
Hello?
hi. Hi, Laura, and hi, Yvette.
Hi, Ricardo.
Hi. So let's wait for people to join. We have 10 more minutes left.
Okay.
Laura, you practiced already, right?
Yes, we
Yeah.
did. Thanks.
Hi, Laura. And by the way, I'm Ricardo, and I will be moderating the session. Today.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
Can you, is
So
my voice loud enough?
it's perfect.
Okay, great.
Perfect. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So uh, do not disconnect, okay?
Okay.
Let me think. Yeah, let's just wait for 10 more minutes and we will start right on time, okay?
Okay.
So you may mute your microphone and then you are muted when we start, okay?
Okay. I'm not sure how to mute it.
Yeah, you see next to your name, there is an icon, a green icon that represents
Oh, yeah.
like a microphone. You just click there or right click there and mute. I don't know if you just click. Okay, there you go. Now it's muted. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this presentation that is part of the Qualitative Methods Masterclass webinar series, which is a partnership between the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology at the University of Alberta, the University of Georgia, and ATLAS.ti. Today, we have Dr. Laura Ellingson, professor from Santa Clara University, who will be presenting Embodiment in Qualitative Research. A few words before we start the presentation. Your microphones are going to be muted during the presentation. This session is being recorded, so you will receive about 4 hours after the end of it. You will receive a message with a video recording. While Dr. Ellingson is presenting, you should feel free to write down your questions using the question section in the GoToWebinar control panel. So you can take a look at the control panel now, and you will be able to practice, say hello to me. In fact, why don't you do that? Because one of you is saying to me that she cannot hear my voice. So I need to make sure that the rest of you can hear me. And I see that Monica is okay, and yeah, Lori is fine as well. So it looks like all is loud and clear. All right, Dr. Ellingson will be presenting for about 40 minutes. And after that, I will read the questions that were submitted, and I will also offer the microphone for you to talk. Now, I would like to offer the microphone to my colleague Yvette Maguat from IIQM, who is going to introduce Dr. Ellingson.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Dr. Laura Ellingson is Professor of Communication and Women and Gender Studies at Santa Clara University. Her passion for methodological and epistemological innovation infuses all of her research and creative work. Dr. Ellingson seeks to enlarge possibilities for spanning theoretical, paradigmatic, and representational boundaries through her articulation of embodiment research strategies and her development of crystallization framework for qualitative research. Narrative, feminist, and pragmatic perspectives guide her ethnographic research in communication in healthcare, delivery, and extended chosen families. In addition to numerous articles and chapters, she is the author of Communicating in the Clinic, Negotiating Frontstage and Backstage Teamwork, and co-author with Dr. Patty Soterin of Anting, Cultural Practices that Sustain Family and Community Life, and Where the Ants Are, Family, Feminism, and Kinship in Popular Culture. Dr. Ellingson, we're very happy to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much, Yvette. Now I will make you a presenter, and you will be able to share your computer screen with all of us, Dr. Ellingson. So let's see. There will be a message that will pop up saying share my screen.
Okay, yeah. I just clicked on that. Can everyone see it?
Yes, we see it perfectly fine.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much. So now please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to get a chance to talk about embodiment and the ways in which I've been thinking and utilizing this perspective. I am sorry, I'm trying to change. There we go. Okay, so my interest in embodiment began with having an unruly body. I am an almost 30-year survivor of a form of bone cancer called osteosarcoma. And I have had numerous what are called salvaging surgeries or reconstructive surgeries on my leg for almost 20 years before having it amputated. The cancer was thankfully controlled after about a year, but the orthopedic problems, all the complications and infections and malfunctionings that happened to my right leg because of the cancer treatment were ultimately not able to be controlled, and I ended up having an amputation about 10 years ago. So this picture that you can see on the slide is a picture of one of my early prosthetic legs, and you'll notice that my kittens are snuggled right up to it and having no problem accommodating the cyborg embodiment of their cat mommy. I began my research training after I became a cancer survivor, in fact, a long-term cancer survivor. And so at no point as I was studying to be a researcher, an interviewer, an ethnographer, was I able to ignore my body. I had a very troublesome and painful leg for many years, and then I progressed to being an amputee, which is also in and of itself complicated. So I'd never been able to ignore my body, and because I wasn't, I became more and more interested in how my body was implicated in my research, which then led to an awareness of how everyone's body is implicated in their research, regardless of whether they have the particular kinds of limitations that I have and the kind of privileges that I have. I am white, I'm heterosexual, and I'm a first world scholar. So I live with a lot of privilege in addition to dealing with sexism and ableism. So my unruly body made me interested, and I became fascinated with everyone else's unruly body as well. So today I want to talk to you briefly about 4 aspects of embodiment in qualitative research, very briefly on the legacy of the mind-body dichotomy, and then again, very briefly on the critiques of this mind-body dichotomy and the ways in which we have pushed back against that. Then why I think it's important that we consider embodiment in qualitative research specifically. And then lastly, some recommendations and ideas on how we can actively do bodies and do embodiment in qualitative research today. So with that overview, I will dive into a very brief history of a few hundred years of the mind-body split. The privileging of the mind over the body is deeply ingrained in our scholarship and in Western cultures as a larger entity. The mind-body separation posits a clear division between the mind, which is equated with the self, and is experienced as proactive and unthreatening, and the body, which is experienced as always already potentially troublesome. Under the legacy of Descartes, rationality dictates that the higher mind and self should seek to control the body as its property, preferably to the point of rendering the body absent or at least irrelevant to any knowledge production or project. This is often referred to as Cartesian dualism, right, or the mind-body split. Such a split renders bodily knowledge oxymoronic. Indeed, it's as though, quote, facts come out of our heads and fictions out of our bodies, Simmons in 1999. Typically, social science researchers conduct and represent research as though knowledge was produced without unruly bodies involved at any point. The performance of disembodied researcher has been repeated so long that it functions as a set of naturalized norms that privilege a masculinist rationality as the only legitimate form of knowledge. And it's accorded only to those with sufficient social privilege to deny their feminine, person of color, disabled, and other kinds of unrulinesses. Leaving our own and others' bodies unmarked in our data and reports and other representations is the privilege of the powerful. Journal articles and other research accounts largely reflect social science norms that frame the researcher's personality, body, and other sources of subjectivity as irrelevant. Disembodied prose appears to come from nowhere, implying a disembodied author. So researchers have used this power to render our bodies as essentially irrelevant, and yet that is not widely accepted, at least among the qualitative folks that I hang out. There's just quite a broad community, obviously, and not everyone agrees. And I think that that is productive and good, as opposed to a source of problems. I'm going to talk briefly about 3 primary groupings of critiques about mind-body privilege. These have come in the wake of a lot of different turns, the narrative turn, but also post-structuralism, postmodernist, Deleuzian, performative, affective, material feminist, post-colonialist, critical race, and post-humanist perspectives on the ways in which our bodies and participants' bodies are part of research. So the first is to resist seeing the body as a container or an object that is then a possession of the self. Instead, post-structuralists and others theorize the body as, quote, as material and visceral set of biological components and functions. That's from Ash and Gallagher in 2015. And also Sakamoto in 2012 adds that the body is a site which a situated self is experiencing experienced. Thus, embodiment refers to, quote, bodies as whole experiential beings in motion, both inscribed and inscribing subjectivities. That is, the experiential body is both a representation of self, that is, a text, as well as a mode of creation in progress, that is, a tool. In addition, embodiment is a state that is contingent upon the environment and the context of the body, end quote. That's from Perry and Medina in 2011. Beliefs about the relationship between the mind and body point to a fundamental tension surrounding what one means when we speak of embodiment or, quote, the body. On the one hand, philosophers and scholars construct a notion of the body as a material entity whose potential meanings are constituted and circumscribed by culture through particular discursive systems that privilege certain sets of norms and values. On the other hand, bodies can also be understood as containing our essential qualities, such as our emotions, our gut instincts, and our physical characteristics, and of course, our material being. That is, cultural meanings certainly vary and have dramatic impact on how we interpret and manifest our bodies, but we cannot completely disassociate such meanings from the concrete, physical, and material reality of the body as a lived entity. Human and body is therefore mutually constitutive with the world around us, and that understanding can inform qualitative research practices. So that's the rejection of the body as a container or an object, and saying that the body and self are together or are one. Secondly, we need to move from a perspective of having a body, right, again, as a possession, to being a body and doing a body. The English language, and certainly Cartesian perspectives, render the body as the possession as the self, as equated with the mind or the brain. An alternative approach integrates mind, body, and for many people as well as spirit. Trin, post-colonialist, for example, says, quote, we do not have bodies, we are bodies. Okay? And Butler and others, feminist theorists, have posited that we enact our bodies in everyday self as what she calls, and others have called, body selves, right? And as we do our body. So instead of having it, we are being a body and doing a body. And Butler says, quote, the body is not merely a matter, but a continual and incessant materializing of possibilities. One is not simply a body, but in some very key sense, one does one's body, and indeed, one does one's body differently from others. The body is always an embodying of possibilities, both conditioned and circumscribed by historical convention, end quote. Thus, the body is understood not merely as a possession of the mind, nor does the self exist in the mind, despite the linguistic convention of saying my body, or I did something, with my body, which suggests just such an arrangement. This linguistic shift to having a body self as hyphenated, as combined, grounds researchers' attention in embodied, contextualized interactions accomplished in lived spaces rather than in abstract meanings. And I take that to mean that we do our bodies and we do embodiment as qualitative researchers, regardless of where you might situate yourself on a continuum of more artistic through more social scientific qualitative research, and anywhere in the middle between those two poles. A third perspective is moving from the body to bodies in the multiple, right? The abstract body, unfortunately, as a legacy of being male and white and first world and straight and privileged in many ways. Yet there is no singular body. And certainly know the body as an experience. Intersectionality, from my perspective, is key to us understanding bodies. And that would need to encompass a whole continuum of genders, of races, of attention to class and disability and sexuality, and many other ways in which we can understand bodies. So rather than seeking to understand a monolithic embodiment, I encourage attention to an incredible multiplicity of experiences of embodiment. Why does this matter now? Why should we be paying attention to embodiment in this moment? There's a lot of reasons, which again, I've distilled down to basically 6 categories of reasons. The first, and I'm going very quickly through this and many other things, I welcome your questions, and I also welcome follow-up conversation. The last slide will have my email address and the citation for the book that I am drawing on when I talk about these things. Anyway, the first of the 6 arguments is that embodiment does big steps towards encompassing both the material and the discursive. Biological essentialism in early research is very unhelpful, very limiting. On the other hand, a purely postmodern focus on the discursive meanings of reality is also unhelpful. And putting these 2 things together is, I argue, a rich and productive way of thinking of ourselves and our research. And an embodiment perspective allows us to put these things together and to look at them as entangled. Secondly, when we look at embodiment, we feature and we pay attention to the ways in which embodiment is at work in knowledge production, we can look at otherwise unknowable topics. Many topics cannot be separated from our experience of ourselves and others' bodies, and that would include things like sexuality and disability, but it also includes experiences of privileged experiences, including being in the academy and being an academic. And more complexly, it has to do with the ways in which anyone's body is interacting with other bodies. For example, in workspaces, we have to understand discourse of organizations, particularly of healthcare delivery, which is what I happen to study. But if we really want to understand the experience of patients, we also have to get into the embodiment of theirs and the healthcare delivering professions as well. Okay, third, embodiment opens up some really rich and exciting possibilities for analysis and representation of our research. It lets us look at all kinds of multisensorial and ways of moving past merely the written world. In no way does it exclude the written word, but it also brings in sound and visuals in some creative ways, and it also pays attention to material realities that can be part of our representations. Fourth, I happen to be partial to crystallization, but other kinds of ways of looking at validity as well, embodiment adds another layer or another facet, right? It can be added onto or incorporated into any other perspectives except for a purely positivist perspective, and I assuming that most of you wouldn't fall into that category. It definitely can fit with post-positivist and artistic perspectives, where we are thinking of validity in rich and complex ways that have to do with aesthetics or with rigor or with both. Okay, fifth, embodiment can help us to reach out beyond the academy to multiple publics and policymakers when we think about material realities, which we do as part of embodiment, and about intersectional bodies that can help us to speak and to communicate in ways that are appealing to, interesting to, but also accessible to people outside of the academy. And then lastly, researcher satisfaction can be, for many people, enhanced with attention to embodiment. As I said, I've never had the luxury of ignoring my embodiment, but even if I had or wanted to, I find tremendous satisfaction, and others do as well, in looking at the ways in which the discursive and the material come together in complex ways. Now, embodiment can also be a topic focus, right? It can actually be what it is you're looking at in research, right? And I am all for that, and actually have a chapter about some of the ways in which body studies research promotes attention to things like, for example, breastfeeding or having a body which has tattoos on it. All of these things are important and interesting ways of making it the focus. However, I'm going to talk today about the second part of this, which is doing embodiment as a research practice and as part of all the processes, all the way from designing, all the way through various ways of making data and collecting data, and through analysis and through choices about representation. All of that is part of doing embodiment, and that is what I am going to focus on today. Okay, there is a rich and really multifaceted set of vocabularies. There are many of them. for talking about embodiment. And I draw primarily on post-structuralist, post-humanist, and feminist and materialist perspectives. However, I am also highly influenced by social constructionism, and I've also learned a lot from post-colonialists and critical race scholars. So there's a lot of ways out there, and I want to be very honest and own the fact that this is my eclectic approach, right? This is from where I come from. These are 7 terms that I find super helpful in trying to talk to other people about how we can not only think about embodiment, but do or practice a conscious and rich, engaged kind of embodiment. So I've already talked about doing bodies, right? Rather than having a body, we're doing our body. But I want to briefly introduce these other terms. I, again, realize I'm going super fast here, so I welcome questions on them. But these are all ways in which we can understand the body. Okay, so the first is the sticky web of culture, and I love that way of thinking about culture as something that we get stuck in. It is not only something that, of course, we choose how to understand or use our bodies because of the influence of culture, but culture actually gets inside our bodies. We eat certain kinds of foods, right? We engage in certain kinds of movements, and we constrain ourselves from other kinds of movements depending upon our cultures and our values and things that we accept, the type of relationships that are promoted or forbidden. And so culture does not remain only a context, but actually becomes internal to our bodies as part of how we act in the world and do our bodies. Secondly, actants are objects, non-human objects. They can be both physical or material, such as a desk or a lamp or the Diet Coke that I'm sipping on at the moment, but they can also be discourses, right? They can be more abstract. And they are things, again, that don't remain external to our experiences of embodiment. They are both part of the culture and the spaces in which we act, but they also deeply influence them. I study healthcare, so the actants I tend to look at are things like medications, equipment for dialysis, that allows filtering of the blood outside of the body. I also look at the ways in which we understand the right to or not the right to in the United States to basic health care, right? And these kinds of discourses and objects have powerful agency, not human agency, but nonetheless a powerful agency that ends up being not only external to our body, but internal to it. I am alive today because of the actants of chemotherapy and of the various things that allow people to do research, to do surgery, such as anesthesia. Okay, moving right along. Intersubjectivity is that we experience our bodies not as independent modernist subjects, but in the context of other people's bodies, right? We learn about our bodies initially, even before birth, really, but after birth, and all the way through our lives by how other people react to our bodies, how we experience our bodies through the interaction with others. Again, this doesn't remain external, but becomes very much part of our physical, mental, emotional sense of ourselves. Embodied knowing is to me, one of the most exciting aspects of embodiment. And this gets at the idea that we don't just have sensations in our bodies and then make sense of them with our brain. Both philosophers who've been arguing this for a very long time, such as Merleau-Ponty, but also neuroscientists are now arguing that we do engage in knowing, in sense making outside of our brains. When we say gut instincts or gut knowing, that's actually a physical thing, not only an abstract one. The next concept is that of flux, or the idea that bodies are always already dynamic. We are constantly producing new cells. Our bodies do not remain exactly the same weight or composition, right? What we eat affects what's in our body at any one time. And yet our research tends to present only a snapshot of bodies and to treat them as though they were stable or at least relatively stable instead of constantly and always in flux. Last concept is the sensorium, which is moving past a very old and outdated model of having 5 senses. Most of us grow up thinking of sight and hearing and taste and touch as separate. And yet, again, both philosophy and research and neuroscientific research demonstrate that our senses are highly blended, that we don't experience them according to only a single organ, but instead they manifest together in very complex ways that cannot be fully separated out, nor should they be. The other aspect of sensorium, though, of the ways in which our senses engage in the world that I want to point out is the proprioceptive system, which is not one of those 5 classically mentioned systems, which is how we engage in movement and where we find ourselves in, or know where we are in space, right? How we can have balance. And that proprioceptive system is something I've become intimately acquainted with as an amputee. But even if you aren't, right, your ability to move and to be able to balance requires that. So the sensorium is much bigger than just what do we tend to privilege. And yet again, we don't tend to show those kinds of things in our research. I'm going to briefly talk to you about how we can engage in doing bodies or doing embodiment in our research practices. And there are just literally an infinite number of things I'd like to talk about, but I will offer instead 3 areas. I'll talk briefly about fieldwork, about doing interviews, and about engaging in analysis. The first is engaging fieldwork, and this has, as I just talked briefly about the sensorium, is having blended senses, not separate, and also about the proprioceptive system. Sarah Pink's work on sensory ethnography has been really foundational, really helpful for me. She's done really fascinating work on laundry, of all the mundane things, of the smells and the textures and the sounds and the things associated with laundry in homes, and also in local food and in slow food festivals and other events that celebrate these approaches, in the idea of tasting and experiencing foods and wines and cultures coming in together in complex and sensory ways that are really fascinating, certainly in field work. One of the things I noticed is the smell of healthcare delivery spaces, mostly hospitals, but also any kind of clinic, the smell of antiseptics, and what I consider to be the smell of fear, right, of the pheromones that very ill people's bodies give off when they are worried, right, that smell is a really visceral part of the experience. And yet we tend to pay attention to what we see and what we hear in ethnography. And so sensory ethnography tries to move past that, and embodiment tries to really richly build on exciting ways in which we can try to attend to our sensorium and to all the other concepts that I've talked about, but that one in particular. So one technique that I recommend, something that I've experimented with, is to try to look at silence as an embodied phenomenon in my fieldwork, to look at what practices make up silence in various spaces. And again, I look at healthcare, but I've also looked a lot at extended family and chosen family networks and the ways in which private homes and the kinds of gathering spaces for aunties and nieces and nephews and loved ones, the ways in which silence can be part of those things as well, and that they aren't just an absence of speech or an absence of noise, but deeply embodied phenomenon. As widely advocated by feminist ethnographers, we can pay attention to embodied silence as much as a form of resistance as well as a sign of oppression. Traditionally, of course, silence has been thought of as othering, but it also has a variety of functions, purposes, and meanings. It's not merely an absence, but deeply embodied. Hoel in 2013 writes that bodies are vessels of meaning and meaning making, at times empowered and loud, but also bereft and silent. A fundamental truth in the communication studies discipline, of which I'm a part, is that you cannot not communicate. People always communicate in some sense of affect, even if it is complacency or other kinds of very mild states. There's always something being communicated. Silence can be powerful and interesting, not just something missing, but an embodied communicative practice and meaningful way of being with others. Silence can also be to indicate a strength and physical and emotional pain. Consciously attending not only to the overt activity of a place or space, but also to the spaces in between that help to give activities meaning is a really rich way of experiencing embodiment. When do your participants enact silence? How do actants producing sounds, for example, the beeping that always seems to be part of medical equipment, there's always a lot of beeping going on, right? How is that beeping interacting with silent people? How is it regulating other objects? How is it signaling in the absence of speech or other kinds of sounds? How is it signaling to healthcare providers who've been trained to hear in certain ways? How do those beeps manifest an important language in the absence of other kinds of verbal indicators? For example, ringing phones might move participants to speech in an office space. Right? Likewise, internal states might lead to sounds. A participant who's frustrated, for example, might emphatically sigh or repeatedly tap their pen against a desk or a table. When participants speak, how and when do they pause? And what do those pauses and silences do? You can spend an entire visit in this field describing silences and noting how participants' whole bodies perform silence, not just their voice or lack thereof. Note what kind of nonverbal communication cues enact silences. For example, is their mouth frowning? Do they have an intense stare or a blank look? Are their face or shoulders relaxed? And if so, how can you tell? Are their arms tightly crossed in front of their chest? Are they making eye contact or not? Right? There's silent tears streaming down their face, or maybe very slowly dripping from their face. Each of these and endless combinations of various kinds of nonverbal cues or body language, facial expressions, those kinds of things, these communicate very different embodied tones of silence into which ethnographers may inquire. And again, that's just one example of the many ways in which we could think of us as doing our bodies and doing embodiment in fieldwork. I want to move next to talking a little bit about interviewing. Researchers tend to act and speak as though knowledge is produced in the mind. Brady in 2011 wrote that, quote, "This researcher's mind is typically regarded as an instrument which is then rationalized in giving meaning as knowledge by the mind." So, end quote. So in resisting the mind-body split, researchers can understand embodiment not only as actions or practices that our bodies do and that our mind subsequently makes sense of, but rather as our whole mind-body selves make sense of the world and has produced knowledge. And again, this goes back to the concept I briefly introduced of embodied knowing. Bodies are in complex systems that include the brain and central nervous system, but which are not interpreted or not solely interpreted by them, such that our consciousness is always and only embodied, holistically integrated into what Howell in 2013 calls an enfleshed subject. And yet, our qualitative research does not typically acknowledge, or it could in many more ways acknowledge, the ways in which all of our knowing is woven throughout our bodies. The sense of researchers and participants' bodies is apparent within the constraints of the silence of researchers and participants' bodies is apparent within the traditional research report writing, and consequently emits vital information and insights. When the body is erased in processing of scholarship, knowledge situated within the body is unavailable. Enfleshed knowledge is restricted by linguistic patterns of positivist dualism, mind-body, objective-subjective, that fix the body as an entity incapable of literacy, and that's from Spry in 2001. Thus, it's not only that the body makes cognitively, right, knowledge out of the raw or perceptive information. Instead, the mind-body system, particularly, or in this case, when you're doing interviews, is feeling and thinking and experiencing and making sense of sensory information holistically all over our bodies. So when we're doing an interview, right, we are having sensations of tension or not in our shoulders, right? Our faces are smiling or perhaps crying with another. Our bodies are relaxing or engaging. Our stomachs feel content and happy, or perhaps become nauseated or feel pain, right? As we are making sense of, in the moment, what our participants and we are talking about. One thing I really recommend is that when you're doing an interview, you try to not only pay attention to, in your moment, what is your body telling you and what do you think your participant's body is telling you, and to follow up on and checking out your interpretations of your participant's body by saying, you look sad, or can you tell me about the emotion you're feeling now, or I noticed that your shoulders went up. Can you tell me what that experience is for you? But also preparing questions ahead of time that elicit embodied experiences. And in my experience, many of participants have trouble trying to really reach into that interior, and trying to have questions that get at embodied experiences that we don't tend to normally talk about can be really helpful to helping your participants to articulate them, as, by the way, can be allowing silence, not trying to rush your participant and letting them have embodied silence, and trying to, as much as you can, have your body portray that you're totally fine with waiting, letting them have a moment to think. Okay? And so anyway, if you form questions ahead of time that help get at not just what people see and hear, but also try to form questions about touching, about taste, about smell, about textures, about temperatures, right? I ask participants how they feel about the fact that operating rooms, for example, are always very cold. I assume that has to do with germs and things, and the fact that the healthcare providers must get very warm. But it is also very unpleasant if you are a patient and awake in it. The textures of the sheets and the bandages and the other kinds of things that you experience in a healthcare setting, right? If you're in an office, what do offices smell like? Right? There's interesting work on how we experience the smells in our workplaces and in our homes and in our neighborhoods. It's very cool stuff on doing not only sound walking interviews, but in looking at the smells and the textures and the ways in which neighborhoods have particular ways of being that can be accessed through attention to embodiment. You can also ask people about different areas of their body, ask them about their limbs, ask them about their belly or their lungs, ask them about their perceptions of movement. How is it, for example, for you as a doctor or a nurse maybe, walking in the clinic or standing in the clinic? What about lifting or carrying something in the clinic? What about sitting in the clinic? What about having to reach over the patient's body in order to get access equipment or medications or other kinds of things, right? What kind of bodily practices in both formal and informal interviews, right? So ones that have been set up or ones that might happen spontaneously during field work, you can respond to participant stories by asking for memories of how their bodies felt in those moments and in what part of their bodies they felt their emotions. The picture that I have here for you on the screen is of a brain being connected to a gut, because that's how I tend to experience my emotions. I tend to experience them through pain in my stomach, or like an aching or a sharp pain, or through nausea, also through sort of just an unsettled or fluttering kind of feeling, right? And in this representation, the brain and the gut are very firmly linked through a cord there. But there's other ways. You might experience your knowing, for example, in your heart, right? Or in your fingers, right? Or in your facial muscles, right? We all have different ways of understanding those things. So when your participants answer about these things, remember that meaning is in the nonverbal cues or body language and facial expressions, as I talked about before, not just in what they say. So often there's more emphasis or echo, more than just emphasis or echoing of your words. Sometimes you can see participants' shoulders slump, right? Before they edit themselves with a cheery answer. Doctors see this all the time. Patients say they're fine, and obviously they're not, right? Or they smile before then giving a really ambivalent response. Follow up on what the participant's body cues are, right? And as much as you can, inquire into these things in a very open and accepting kind of way. I need to skip along. Very briefly, I want to talk about analysis as a very much a material thing. We tend to think of this, most of us, and do it in computers. Now we engage in analysis, but we also can think of it as a deeply engaged, embodied experience wherein we read data, we listen to recordings, we view photographs or maps or other images, we make notes using our hands, whether that's on a keyboard, right? Or we might make notes using our voices for people who don't type, right? We use our whole bodies to process data. And we can think of analysis as an important sense, a material process, not only a virtual one, and certainly not only a mind one. The ways in which we scribble in margins or make notes using software, all of these things, underlining things, it's a connection of the materiality of our data and of the entire process in which our whole bodies are engaged in sense making. When we think of cutting and pasting, which was a literal thing, right? Some of us like to color on and use different kinds of pens and underline and circle things and make notations in the margins. Others like to use computers to cut and paste. And when we do these things, right, we engage in some important sense making. When we're able to take quotes from lots of different participants and put them in one place or connect them, right, that is a very powerful visual act, a material act that shapes our thinking. When we're able to take things that happened at different times and connect them together using software or using literally cutting and pasting of pieces of papers together, right, we, as Konopasek in 2008 says, we form, quote, a textual laboratory which has the power to shrink time and space distances between observable phenomena so that everything important is present and under control, end quote. This grouping and networking and coding and commenting on, right, enables researchers to visualize and to feel viscerally connections among our ideas, deeply impacting our continuing construction of meaning. It's not just about data collection, but about analysis in some very powerful ways. When we move things around, we are doing things with them. And I recommend that we try to harness the materiality of our analysis, regardless of which kind of system you might use. So if you like physical, right, which I do, if you like office supplies, colored pens, sticky notes, folders, paper, right, then get some of those giant flip charts, which are like giant sticky notes, right, and hang them on your walls to surround yourselves with visual representations of connections between themes and people and actants. Maybe make lists of ideas and concepts and tasks, or lay papers and note cards out all over a floor or a large conference table, moving them around to help you make and change the connections that you are making or not seeing or not experiencing, right? If you have the luxury of a dedicated workspace, do a little redecorating of the space to help it to reflect the processes that you're engaging in. If you work wherever you can find a space, which most of us tend to do, get a snazzy cover for your laptop or a great computer bag or tote or messenger bag to hold your work and your supplies, but own and be aware of, try to be conscious of the materiality of analysis. Lastly, if you are a real dedicated computer user, which many people are, right, you can save your data files and of course back them up many different ways in different spaces, but then make play copies of your data in which you can cut and paste and highlight and annotate to your heart's content by pointing and clicking and dragging and typing. If you like being able to rearrange files and ideas when you're writing, you might consider the Scrivener software, which is available online. I don't get a cut from them, but I do enjoy their software, right? It lets you basically simultaneously see an outline of your work and all of its parts and be working on separate sections of your work and have what look like visual note cards where you can keep notes about whatever it is that you are writing. Many people like other kinds of qualitative analysis software, such as ATLAS, Hyper Research, Nudist, In Vivo, and MaxQda. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that one. Most of the software packages have capacities for linking files that let you do what others have called embodied multimodal coding and analysis. That is software that lets you bring together visual hyperlinking documents, photos, videos, drawings, maps, and other kinds of text, and that with language or transcripts, right, or with your own words. And this visual juxtaposition and auditory juxtaposition, right, may spark intra-actions that would not have happened without the collapsing of time and space that can be accomplished through this very material rearranging of data, not only and constituting the data in the first place, but then rearranging it by bringing disparate moments together. And being able to do that multiple ways and multiple times of bringing these things together. The more you can make the work and the play of analysis, think of it as physical work, the more opportunity you have to engage your whole body self in your meaning-making processes, in your body of data, and to imaginatively foster various kinds of interactions. I am very passionate in talking about embodiment, and I love being able to talk more about it. My book that came out of that topic is from Routledge, came out last year. I also blog about being a person who lives with late effects of cancer treatment or the ongoing complexities of long-term cancer survivors at realisticallyever.blog. And then lastly, my email here is here as well, Ellingson@scu.edu. And I really do welcome perspectives. I'm at a wonderful liberal arts school, but I don't have graduate students or a lot of other colleagues locally who I can talk these exciting ideas about embodiment with. So I welcome hearing from other scholars. And at this point, I'm going to stop and open it up to your questions.
Thank you very much. So let me see. We have a few people who have already written some questions, and I will see if I can offer the microphone to some of them. Let me see here. Carlene, I will offer you the microphone. Let me see. Just a second. Carlene is here. Okay, here you go. I will unmute you so your microphone is open. Go ahead.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Okay, Dr. Ellingson, perhaps I can just say I really appreciated this. I'm an educational kinesiologist and a research psychologist, so this for me has been the epitome of bringing the two worlds together. And I do it a lot when I do training, especially with qualitative research, where I try to break very abstract concepts down to physical things that people can experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I can just say that this has been absolutely brilliant in reaffirming that the way that I do things is valid. It is useful. There are people writing books about it, so this is definitely
Thank you
something
so
I will
much.
invest in. But thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, at the moment I don't really have any other questions, but just a deep appreciation for what you have been through and what you have shared with us. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. I want to pick up on what you said about training. I too
Yeah.
find that having when you're training, bringing things into concrete and physical helps people's comprehension. But I argue it does more than that. It doesn't just help people to understand an abstract concept, which is in and of itself really important. But when you're trying to train people to do things, and I do teach qualitative methods on the undergrad level and feminist methods, and trying to help them have a kinesthetic experience of things really shapes not just their understanding of abstract concepts, but of practices and processes. And I find it sounds like you do, in a very powerful way. For example, I have my research students, I give them sets of blocks that are in different shapes and colors and ask them to make those into themes, right? How could they define a coherent theme, and what different ways could they do that? And that kind of physical moving and visualizing and hearing the clicking together of blocks, I think is a really powerful tool.
Absolutely. I think on a neurological level, the synapse interaction there is just blowing your mind.
Yeah,
and it just makes connections that you otherwise would not.
Absolutely. And it raises questions, right? It makes connections, and it shows where we can't quite make a connection. I think it helps them articulate questions and things too. So I'm really thrilled that you're appreciating this and that it's helpful to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
So
you.
now we have a question from Alicia, and she's asking if you could repeat the name of that software for cutting and pasting visually. To cut and
yes. It's called Scrivener. For those of you who I was an English major, Bartleby Scrivener, that's where the name comes from. For anybody who may have had to read the English literature. But Scrivener is the software, and it's if you just Google that word, Scrivener software, it'll come right up.
Okay, thank you. Peter has a question for you, and I will see if he is available to talk. I'm going to open your microphone, Peter. Go ahead.
Peter?
Are you there? Maybe his microphone does not work. Okay, yes, he just wrote that he doesn't have a microphone. So,
okay.
So I will read this out loud for
Thank
you. He wrote the following: thank you for the great presentation. Many say the brain creates phantom limb sensation pain. Any thoughts on how it is embodied beyond the brain? Specifically, I am thinking of congenitally absent limbs where there is no amputation tissue injury.
Yeah, this is fascinating. And as someone who unfortunately lives with phantom limb pain, I have paid a lot of attention to the research and am as frustrated, I think, as everyone else is. They have some ideas, but they are really inconclusive about what actually causes it. And the congenital missing limb is particularly powerful because it's not like it used to be there, right? My brain remembers it, and it's mostly very unpleasant sensations. But actually, I had phantom cat lap the other day when one of my kitties was sitting on my lap, and I could feel the warmth and the pressure on my prosthetic leg socket, which was a very interesting experience as well. So I think it's not just pain; it's all kinds of sensations, and I don't know the sort of the physics of how the brain does it, but my argument would be is that from everything that I have read, both philosophy and neuroscience, is that it's not that the brain is making it up. It's that the brain and the central nervous system and the whole body is an integrated system, and that whole system is doing its best to not only deal with the sort of external signals and cues that it may be getting, the sensory input that it's getting, like for example, somebody touching your body, but also it's imagination, right? As people become aware of their bodies, they become aware that other people, for example, have two legs or have two arms or have two hands or other things that they may not themselves have. And I think that our imaginations are incredibly powerful. That's what makes qualitative research so fun. I mean, I wouldn't do this if it wasn't. I mean, it's also tedious and annoying, but but it's also a great deal of fun and very satisfying. And I think that's because of our imaginations. And I would argue that it's the imagination as part of our body, not just something that thinks about our body, but that is grounded in our bodily experiences, that can literally imagine a limb that was never there, or that can imagine a hand that you were born without. And I know that my body is thinking about its past experiences, but one of the things that's really interesting about phantom leg pain in particular, for people who've had their legs amputated, is that most of the pain that I experience is a very bad burning and very sharp, almost like a needle kind of pain in my foot, but there was never anything wrong with my foot. All of the surgeries that I had to reconstruct my leg were from my mid calf up through almost the top of my femur, which is my thigh bone, and through my knee, right? But I do occasionally have phantom stabbing pain in those areas, but the vast majority of the pain that I take medication for, was imagined by my brain, because there's a lot more nerves in your foot. There's many senses in your feet, sensors, and there's many different kinds of nerves there. And that's why if most people, if they step on a rock, can get enough information to immediately compensate for that information. I can't do that if I step on a rock or stub my toe with my prosthetic foot, right? But my brain nonetheless imagines pain in that remote part of my body. So whether it's congenital or amputation, we know that the brain is literally inventing. And while I happen to find that unfortunately quite painful much of the time, it's not always negative, and it's always a source of interest. And I would argue that it's imagination, and that imagination is grounded in our whole body, not merely in the brain. But that said, I, like all other researchers, are merely positing an educated guess. We don't actually have any proof, or not anything conclusive.
Thank you. I will offer the microphone to Marcela Herrera. I wonder if you have an open microphone. It's open now. Go ahead.
Hello?
Hello.
Yes, hear you.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for sharing this with us. It's totally a new thing for me, so it was like an eye-opening way of seeing things in research. So my question is, I wonder, once you have your impressions about the participants' body responses, how do you interpret that, or how do you transfer that into your analysis, into the actual paper? I'm thinking about a dissertation. How do you do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do that in a number of ways. When I think about my participants' bodily experiences, I make extensive field notes about them. So that's one way, is to try to get it into a written form, or some people prefer making sound files where they sort of talk out loud and try to work out their impressions that way. So getting that down. Another thing I do is to re-listen to my recordings if I have interviews, or reread my field notes, or both, and try to what one of the authors I draw on calls re-sensualize the experience, right? Try to not only remember it in the sense of remembering sort of what happened or listening again to their words, but try to re-sensualize, try to think about the ways in which my body was responding with their body. And then when I go to write a dissertation, and the reason so it can be very difficult, and I always tell students, you got to do whatever you got to do to get out of your program, right? And to get a job, and to be marketable, and to be considered valid by whatever set of rules it is that you're constrained by. So never feel ashamed of that or apologize for that. But that said, I'm a big fan of crystallization, which rethinks validity as something that has to do with combining both more artistic and more social scientific forms of knowledge, because of the very issue that you bring up, which is how do you show this embodied knowing, right, and the participants' embodied responses in a dissertation. And the way I did that was to have a multi-genre dissertation. I wrote a chapter that was autoethnographic. I wrote a chapter that was narrative ethnography. I wrote a chapter that was a fairly, very much social constructionist, but not, but still pretty, very conventional grounded theory analysis, right? With themes and categories and excerpts from both field notes and from interviews to support those claims that I made, right? And rich descriptions. And I could put a lot more of my participants' embodied experiences into the autoethnography and the narrative ethnography, and then later in the book, because my committee wasn't as big on it, I developed a feminist analysis chapter as well, to really deconstruct a lot of what I constructed in the other chapters, and the grounded theory. And in the grounded theory, you're just missing most of that. It's just not there, right? You're missing 100% of my embodied experiences. And so to me, the way to get that is to use different genres. And some people use video or performance or audio ethnography, right? There's all kinds of different ways to represent. And if your committee's not into that, that's okay. Don't feel bad about it. Write whatever you need to write for them, or otherwise constitute your dissertation. And then when you're done, right, you can do these things separately. I published separate autoethnographic works and separate grounded theory works, where I've really put that embodied sensory detail explicitly into the autoethnography. However, I know that my grounded theory analysis was heavily influenced by the other kinds of sense making in which I engaged. And I have published pieces that really blend art and science to try to show the ways in which, for example, poetic transcription can come together with grounded theory analysis to help us have a more artful and or aesthetic appreciation of participants' comments. So the short answer is it's hard to do, right? And the longer answer is I do it using multiple genres, and I accept that you often have to publish or otherwise share those in separate spaces. My first book, Communicating in the Clinic, which was from Hampton Press, though I did put them all in one chapter. It has autoethnography and narrative ethnography, feminist critique, and grounded theory analysis. Now, I gotta be honest, the book did not sell very well. It freaked out the health community. It won a bunch of awards, ironically, but it did not sell very well. The really social science people in health communication just couldn't make sense of it. They were like, what the hell is this thing with all this, narrative and weird stuff in it? But the ethnography people didn't like the grounded theory, right? And they didn't like the very social science framing of the ideas. So it's very complicated, but I really appreciate your question, and I urge you to be strategic, to do what you have to do at each stage of your career, but to always leave open the possibility of incorporating an embodiment in more explicit ways later. Even if they remain implicit now, they are great sense-making activities for you, no matter what kind of dissertation you're producing.
Thank you very much. We are coming to the end. There are a few more questions that were not answered. And I'm wondering if people should feel free to write to you.
Absolutely. Please email me. It's ellingson@scu.edu, and I'd be very happy to hear from people with questions or comments.
Okay, so Monica, you ask a question. It will not be responded because of time, but feel free to write to Dr. Ellingson about that. And before I close, I would like to offer the microphone to Yvette from IIQM, and she will say a few last words. Thank you very much, Dr. Ellingson, for your presentation. Yvette?
Thanks, Ricardo, and thank Dr. Ellingson. That was a wonderful presentation. I want to thank all of you for joining us today and all the other masterclass webinars that have taken place and will continue to take place. Our next one is August 9th, and the presenter will be Kelly Guillot, and the topic will be confronting the visual in qualitative inquiry. So you can go to the IIQM.ualberta.ca webpage and register for that webinar next month.
Thank you,
Thanks so
Yvette.
much for having me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ellingson, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. You will be receiving an email with the recording of this webinar in a few hours from now. Thank you, all of you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.